Picture this. It's 1875. The British Empire is at the absolute height of its global power, right? But behind closed doors in London, the government is just in a total panic.
Right, they're scrambling.
Exactly. Because they desperately want a controlling stake in the newly built Suez Canal. It is the ultimate shortcut to India. I mean, it shaves weeks off the journey, bypassing that whole trip around Africa.
That's a massive geopolitical prize.
Huge. But there's a catch. They need £4 million to buy the shares. In today's money, you're looking at hundreds of millions of dollars, and they need it immediately before a rival power swoops in.
And the reality of 1875 is that you can't just, wire that kind of massive liquidity from a central bank reserve.
Right.
The financial architecture to pull off a transaction of that size, literally on a few days' notice, it simply didn't exist at the state level.
So the British government doesn't go to another country for a loan. They go to one family in London, one banking house. And that family effectively just writes the check.
Yeah, it sounds completely made up.
It sounds like the setup to some crazy internet conspiracy theory, but it's just history. So today we are doing a deep dive into the staggering reality of the Rothschilds. We're pulling from our historical sources to separate the mythology from the actual mechanics of how one single family laid the financial groundwork for the modern world.
And to do that, it really requires us to completely reframe how we think about money and historical leverage, because this isn't just a story about a family getting rich.
No.
It's really the story of the birth of global capitalism. I mean, if you want to understand how a family gets to the point where they can casually buy a massive stake in the Suez Canal for the British Empire, you have to look at the sheer scale of their trajectory.
Yeah, we're talking about a rise from a really marginalized, legally restricted community in 18th century Germany to literally dictating the financial capacity of empires. Okay, let's unpack this, because they obviously didn't start in a boardroom. We have to rewind the 1700s to the city of Frankfurt, Germany, to see how the founder, Maya Amschel Rothschild, actually generated his seed capital.
Right, so Frankfurt at that time was what they called a free imperial city. Think of it almost like an independent city-state within the Holy Roman Empire.
Like a Monaco or Singapore today.
Exactly like that. It was a major commercial hub, really famous across Europe for these massive trade fairs. But the reality for the Rothschild family living there was incredibly harsh.
Yeah, Maya Amschel started out in a severely cramped house. Like at one point, the sources say over 24 people were living in it.
Yeah, the living conditions were brutal.
And the historical context here is so crucial to understanding the pivot into finance. Jewish families in Europe had been pushed into very specific geographic and economic corners for centuries. By the time we get to 18th century Frankfurt, Jewish citizens were legally restricted from participating in farming or owning land or even joining the traditional artisan guilds.
They were systematically locked out of the primary economies of the era, but they were pushed toward one specific sector, which was money lending. And the reason for this goes back to strict Christian religious laws that forbade usury, which was basically the practice of lending money at interest. The church considered it a sin.
So European society effectively forced Jewish communities into this highly stigmatized economic niche.
Exactly. But in doing so, they inadvertently handed them the exact tools that would end up defining the future of global finance.
And I want to look at how Maya Amschel actually utilized those tools, because he didn't just open a neighborhood bank. He was sitting at the epicenter of a massive operating system upgrade in the global economy.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, Europe was moving away from mercantilism, which was essentially the belief that wealth was a finite resource. Like if you wanted a bigger piece of the global pie, you have to build a navy and physically take someone else's piece.
Which is a total zero-sum game.
Exactly. But right around the mid-1700s, the economic philosophy shifts toward what we now recognize as capitalism. The idea that you can actually grow the pie through reinvestment, credit, and managing capital efficiently.
And Maya Amschel didn't just understand this shift. He leveraged it perfectly.
But how does a guy in a cramped house in Frankfurt actually get the capital to play that game on a massive scale?
Well, by understanding that the real leverage wasn't in lending his own money to local merchants. The real leverage was in managing sovereign wealth.
Ah, right.
Maya Amschel managed to secure a position handling the vast fortune of William IX, the Landgrave of Hesse-Kassel. This guy was an extraordinarily wealthy German prince who essentially rented out his private military to other countries.
Wait, so if I'm understanding the mechanic here, Maya Amschel is acting almost like the anchor investor in a modern venture capital fund.
Yes, precisely.
He's using this massive pool of the prince's capital to dictate terms and make large-scale loans, which just gives him a level of influence he could never achieve with his own savings.
Exactly. He was sitting on a mountain of German state money, managing the float, right precisely when the entire European continent was about to be completely engulfed in conflict.
Because the French Revolution kicks off in 1789, the monarchy falls, and suddenly Austria, Prussia, and eventually Britain are all drawn into decades of war with France.
And war is incredibly expensive.
Yeah, to say the least.
It requires immediate, massive liquidity. So Maya Amschel is perfectly positioned to loan out capital to these warring powers. It's the ultimate pivot from local moneylender to geopolitical financier.
Wow.
But managing one German prince's money only gets you so far. If you want to scale that into a permanent global empire, you have to solve a massive logistical problem.
How to move the money.
Right. How do you move money and information across a continent that is actively tearing itself apart?
Here's where it gets really interesting, because this brings us to the famous strategy of the 5 arrows. As the Napoleonic Wars escalate, Maya Amschel does something structurally brilliant. He sends his 5 sons to establish permanent branches in 5 key European cities.
Frankfurt, London, Paris, Vienna, and Naples.
Right. 5 arrows, acting as one unified, decentralized network.
And what's fascinating here is how this structure essentially allowed the family to hedge the Napoleonic War.
Hedging a continental war, that's wild.
Think about the physical mechanics of it. You have the French branch run by James, embedded in Paris and navigating Napoleon's empire. But simultaneously, you have the London branch, run by Nathan, actively bankrolling the British military who were trying to destroy Napoleon.
Okay, hold on, I need to stop you there. Because if they are operating a unified family network, and one brother is funding the British while the other is sitting in Paris under Napoleon, how are they not immediately executed for treason?
Right, especially since Napoleon famously tried to blockade Britain with his continental system.
Exactly. How did the Rothschilds move anything across those borders?
By turning an unenforceable embargo into a highly profitable, deeply clandestine supply chain. They had the capital to bribe port officials, charter neutral ships, utilize hidden compartments, and because they had family members on both sides of the English Channel, they could coordinate the transfer of gold and supplies with a level of trust that literally no other smuggling operation could match.
So they essentially acted as a shadow financial system that bypassed the blockades entirely.
Completely.
But the real masterpiece of this network wasn't just moving gold, was it? It was moving information.
Precisely. They built a private network of couriers. We're talking fast ships, fast horses, and encrypted letters. Because they had outposts across the continent, their intelligence network was often faster and more accurate than the intelligence networks of the sovereign governments they were lending to.
Which leads us directly to 1815, the Battle of Waterloo.
The big one.
The absolute climax of the Napoleonic Wars. The entire fate of the European map is hanging in the balance. The British and their allies finally defeat Napoleon. But Nathan Rothschild, sitting in London, finds out about the victory before the British government does, thanks to his private courier network.
Which is just an unbelievable advantage.
Right, and he uses that advanced knowledge to make an absolute fortune on the London bond market. But walk me through the actual mechanics of this. I understand he knew who won the war first. But mechanically, how does that translate into cold, hard cash on a trading floor?
So you have to look at how governments fund wars. The British government issued debt in the form of bonds, which were known as consols.
Okay.
The value of these bonds was directly tied to the survival of the British government. If Napoleon wins at Waterloo and marches on London, those bonds might default and become completely worthless.
Makes sense.
But if Britain wins, the government is secure, and those bonds become incredibly valuable, steady investments.
So the market is essentially taking bets on the survival of the country.
Exactly. And when the battle was happening, the London market was incredibly anxious. Information was super scarce. Then Nathan receives word from his courier that Britain won.
And he goes straight to the exchange.
He goes to the exchange, and rather than immediately buying, historical accounts suggest he started selling.
Right, selling.
Yes, which triggered an immediate panic. Other traders saw the most informed man in London dumping his bonds, assumed Britain had lost, and desperately sold off their own holdings, crashing the price.
Oh my God.
Once the price hit rock bottom, Nathan's agent secretly bought up massive quantities of the heavily discounted bonds.
Wow. So by the time the official government messengers finally arrived with the news of victory, the bond prices skyrocketed, and Nathan practically owned the market.
He multiplied his family's fortune exponentially in a matter of hours. By establishing a multinational network before the concept of a multinational corporation even existed, they ensured that no matter which country won the war on the battlefield, the Rothschilds won the peace on the balance sheet.
That is just incredible.
They transitioned out of the Napoleonic era, holding immense goodwill from the victors, and a level of capital that was just completely unprecedented for a private entity.
So the wars finally end. The map of Europe settles down a bit. You have this family sitting on this massive war chest. What is the next move? I mean, if you are no longer funding destruction, you have to pivot, right?
You pivot to funding creation. The 19th century rapidly becomes the era of industrialization and infrastructure. And what governments quickly realize is that their ambitions are strictly limited by what their financiers will allow them to afford.
And our source has a perfect example of this in 1822. Brazil wants to declare independence from Portugal. Now, historically, a colony breaking away from an empire means a long, grueling, very expensive military conflict.
Almost always.
But that's not what happens here. Instead, Nathan Rothschild steps in, negotiates a massive loan to Brazil, and Brazil uses that money to essentially pay off Portugal. They just bought their independence.
Think about the profound paradigm shift there. War was no longer just decided by who had the most men or the most cannons. Geopolitical disputes were being resolved through sovereign debt. Portugal wanted financial compensation for losing a massive revenue stream. Brazil didn't have the cash on hand. So by fronting the money, the Rothschilds completely avoided a transatlantic war. The money was transferred to Portugal, and Brazil simply owed the Rothschilds the debt.
It's crazy. If you wanted to build a nation, you practically had to clear it with their credit department. And it wasn't just geopolitics, it was physical infrastructure too. As we get into the 1830s and 40s, they financed the European railway boom.
Right, laying the tracks for the modern world.
Yeah, they provide the seed capital for the industrialization of France and the newly independent nation of Belgium.
And eventually, the extraction of global resources. In the 1880s, massive diamond and gold deposits are discovered in South Africa. The history books usually focus on Cecil Rhodes as the face of British colonialism in that region. He's the one building the operations. Yeah. But the Rothschilds were the wallet. Both the London and French branches invested massive amounts of capital into what became De Beers, which obviously went on to monopolize the global diamond trade for over a century.
They were completely ubiquitous. They had their hands in railways, sovereign debt, diamonds. They were basically functioning like a modern central bank, weren't they?
In many ways, they really were the lender of last resort. Today, if a major financial institution or a government faces a severe liquidity crisis, they turn to entities like the Federal Reserve or the European Central Bank.
Right, the big institutional safety nets.
Exactly. But in the 19th century, those institutions didn't exist with that kind of global capacity.
Yeah.
If the British government faced a cash shortage in the 1820s, or the Austrian government couldn't afford their military occupations in the 1860s, they went to the Rothschilds.
But having that level of visibility and controlling the financial choke points of entire empires, that obviously paints a massive target on your back. As we move deeper into the 19th century, our source details a very dark backlash.
Yes, it's a crucial part of the historical record.
There's a rise in what was termed scientific racism, and alongside it, a massive surge in anti-Semitic propaganda, specifically targeting the family's wealth. We want to be clear that we are just reporting what the historical documents state here.
Right. The family's sheer success and decentralized power were weaponized against them.
Yeah.
These anti-Semitic tropes, this idea of a Jewish family secretly pulling the strings of global governments, gained immense traction during periods of economic instability.
Yeah.
And these are the exact same conspiracy theories that would later be co-opted and amplified by fascist groups in the 20th century to justify horrific persecution.
And the family navigated this intense pressure and just the general massive inequality of the Victorian era with extensive philanthropy. They heavily funded relief efforts during the Irish potato famine in the 1840s and provided financial aid during the Scottish Highland clearances.
They were actively paying to help displaced families immigrate to the Americas or Australia.
They did. But they also possessed a level of wealth that allowed for some highly eccentric behavior, which served as a very public demonstration of their status.
You have to be talking about Walter Rothschild.
I am. This is one of those historical footnotes that perfectly illustrates what untouchable wealth looks like. So Walter was a member of parliament in London, but his real passion was zoology. He amassed a private collection of millions of animal specimens. He rode giant tortoises. And most famously, he trained 4 live African zebras to pull his carriage, and he drove them straight to Buckingham Palace.
That is just such a vivid image.
It was ostensibly to prove they could be domesticated, but let's be honest, rolling up to the king in a zebra-drawn carriage is the ultimate 19th century flex.
Absolutely. But that same immense financial weight also put them in the center of profound, often very uncomfortable historical complexities.
Yes, and I want to look closely at a major loan Nathan Rothschild orchestrated for the British government in 1833. The purpose of this loan was to fund the abolition of slavery throughout the British Empire.
Which is a massive historical moment.
It is. On the surface, providing the capital to end a horrific practice sounds noble. But the actual mechanics of how this was achieved are fascinating and really complex. The British government didn't defeat the plantation owners militarily or legally force them to surrender their assets for nothing.
No.
They used the Rothschild capital to essentially buy the plantation owners out of the economy. They financially compensated the people who were perpetuating the system.
This raises an important question about how 19th century politics actually functioned. Social change was rarely a clean, moral victory. Abolition was achieved, but it required a massive political and financial compromise.
A huge one.
The government needed to inject a massive amount of liquidity to pay off those owners and prevent a total economic collapse in the colonies. The Rothschilds provided the structural capacity to make that compromise possible. And, we see them using their financial weight to force political outcomes elsewhere, too.
Like during the Crimean War.
It's exactly. In the 1850s, Britain and France go to war against the Russian Empire to halt Russian expansion. The Rothschilds helped finance the British war effort, and historical records indicate that Lionel de Rothschild did this largely to oppose Russian policies.
Their institutional anti-Semitism.
Right. He was deeply against Russia's Pale of Settlement, which strictly limited where Jewish people were legally allowed to live. So he took a significant financial risk to fund the war against Russia, essentially using sovereign debt as a tool to pressure an oppressive regime.
And that ideological use of capital eventually extended into the Zionist movement as well. As anti-Semitism worsened across Europe in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, members of the French branch, like Alphonse and James de Rothschild, used their personal wealth to buy tracts of land from the Ottoman government and local landlords in the Levant.
Right, laying the groundwork.
Yeah, they financed the early agricultural settlements that eventually led to the State of Israel. Decades later, family foundations literally funded the construction of the Israeli parliamentary building, the Knesset, and the Supreme Court. They weren't just funding infrastructure anymore, they were physically shaping the geopolitical map.
They were. But the world map was about to violently shift in ways that even their massive capital couldn't control. The dawn of the 20th century fundamentally squeezed the dynasty, and it completely reshaped what the name Rothschild means today.
So what does this all mean? Because the 20th century was essentially a series of devastating hits to their monopoly, right?
Oh, absolutely. It starts with the Great Depression. In 1931, their major Austrian banking institution, Credit Anstalt, collapses.
Just totally goes under.
And it collapsed because it had overextended itself. In an attempt to stabilize the post-World War I economy, it had bought up several smaller, failing banks. When the global depression hit, the weight of those bad assets dragged the entire institution down, and its failure actually became the epicenter of the European financial crisis.
And then World War II breaks out. The Nazis systematically seized the Rothschild properties, their banks, and their massive art collections across Central Europe. Louis Nathaniel de Rothschild, who was running Vienna operations, is actually arrested by the Gestapo and held hostage for months until the family pays a massive ransom.
It was devastating for them.
Most of the Austrian branch has to flee to Switzerland or the US, leaving the bulk of their regional wealth behind. And even after the war, the geopolitical landscape just kept shifting against them. In 1981, the newly elected socialist government in France literally nationalized one of the major Rothschild banking branches.
They really lost their unquestioned dominance over global finance, yet the family survived. And they survived because, over the previous century, they had diversified their holdings so extensively that no single crisis could wipe them out entirely.
And my favorite example of that diversification is the wine.
Oh, yes.
In the 1850s, the French branch buys into the Bordeaux wine industry, acquiring the famous Chateau Lafite. But shortly after they buy it, The invention of fast steamships accidentally brings a microscopic aphid from America to Europe.
The phylloxera virus.
Right. This insect carries the phylloxera virus, which starts rotting the roots of vineyards across the entire continent.
It was an existential threat to the whole French wine industry. Most independent vineyards simply went bankrupt because they couldn't afford to tear up their crops and wait around for a cure.
But the Rothschilds had virtually unlimited capital from their other ventures. They could afford to absorb the losses and just weather the storm for decades. They kept the estate running until botanists figured out that you could graft American voti roots, which were immune to the aphid, onto the European grapevines.
That's brilliant.
They saved the crop, and today the Chateau Lafite estate alone is valued at an estimated 4 billion euros.
So when we look at the reality of the family today, we have to contrast their actual position with those persistent internet myths.
Right, because if you go online, you will inevitably find videos claiming the Rothschilds still command trillions of dollars and secretly dictate global policy. But the reality is much more complex. Their wealth just diluted over time, didn't it?
It did. If we connect this to the bigger picture, a great comparison is the Vanderbilt dynasty in America.
Oh, that's a good comparison.
Right. In the mid-19th century, Cornelius Vanderbilt controlled the railroads and was likely the wealthiest man on earth. But today, you don't hear about a single Vanderbilt controlling the U.S. economy. That immense wealth was dispersed among hundreds of heirs across multiple generations, diluted by taxes, philanthropy, and, varying degrees of business acumen. The exact same process happened to the Rothschilds.
There's no single trillionaire sitting in a boardroom pulling all the strings.
No, they are still incredibly wealthy, of course. When you aggregate the various branches, the family trusts, and their corporate entities like Rothschild & Co., which manages over $100 billion in assets, they still control vast sums of money. They hold substantial stakes in financial advisory, mining, and luxury estates. But they transitioned from being the single, undisputed engine of global finance to being just one of many wealthy shareholders. The modern financial landscape is now heavily dominated by massive, publicly traded institutional banks, not single families.
It has been an absolutely epic journey. We started with a red shield, which is what the name Rothschild translates to, hanging on a cramped house in 18th century Frankfurt. We walked through how they leveraged a German prince's fortune to act as early venture capitalists.
Yeah.
How they played the margins of the Napoleonic Wars, utilized a private courier network to exploit the bond market at Waterloo, prevented a war in Brazil with a checkbook, drove zebras through London, and survived the devastating rise of the Nazis to remain a fixture in modern finance.
And for you listening, whether you are paying a mortgage, investing in an index fund, or just looking at how your country manages its national debt, you are interacting with a financial architecture that this specific family helped prototype. The mechanics of sovereign debt, the structure of multinational communication, the flow of international capital. These weren't just abstract economic theories. They were practical tools forged by a family that understood exactly how the modern world was going to operate before anyone else did.
Which leaves me with one final kind of mind-bending thought for you to ponder.
Yeah.
When you dig into the historical records, alongside their undeniable strategic brilliance, it's clear that pure timing and luck played a massive role in their initial rise.
Absolutely.
Think about Nathan Rothschild's massive information advantage at the Battle of Waterloo. His physical courier network made him the wealthiest man of his era. But what if the telegraph had been invented just 20 years earlier? A technology that instantly neutralizes any physical courier by transmitting information at the speed of light.
That changes everything.
Right. If the telegraph exists in 1815, the government knows the outcome of Waterloo at the exact same time Nathan does. The panic selling doesn't happen. The massive foundational spike of wealth never materializes. If a single copper wire had been strung across the English Channel a generation sooner, would the Rothschild Empire as we know it have ever truly existed? And if not, what would the map of the modern world even look like today?